A favourite of yours, is it?
I feel like it's a favorite of games discussion for a long time. Yeah.
So again, this did come up on Reddit, talking about some ways to avoid Ludo-narrative dissonance, and I thought it's quite interesting to have a look at this. So, do you want to describe what Ludo-narrative dissonance is to anyone who maybe doesn't? There's the examples right there on screen. So,
Yeah, I guess my read on Ludo-narrative dissonance is essentially, uh, I guess if you break it down, Ludo is meant to be like the game, the play aspect, right? And the
yeah.
narrative is the story, the narrative of it.
Hmm.
And so then dissonance means in opposition. Essentially, they
Yeah.
are not meshing well. So
Yeah.
the way I've always understood it is that the narrative is telling the player something, but the gameplay is telling them the opposite or
Hmm.
something which is in contrast to it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the examples there, it's often a case of you play as the good guy, but when you play, you are killing people, and we typically don't see that as good. So,
That's quite true. Yes, that's very true. So, but also like even less morally challenging instances. So the example I got here with the forest, and I can think of many times I've been in the same situation in a game where there's some sort of urgent thing you really have to do, and yet it's got the example here of searching for a kidnapped child, but you can go and build your treehouse and do other stuff. This is, I think, one of the classics that we often see in games. So something is vitally important, but there's no timer, and I think, look, to be honest, to put a timer in there might be more realistic, but wouldn't necessarily be something you want for the game. So I'm not sure whether there's a
yeah,
solution to that one.
there is
Yeah.
I think it was a GMTK video where I guess the root of that was with XCOM 2 and
Hmm.
specifically the DLCs that they made for it. There was I guess the developers spoke somewhere about they had time limits in the missions and had a lot of pushback from players that they didn't
Yeah.
like the time limits.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, they spent a lot of time trying to rethink how you can apply that pressure but without specifically a time limit.
Hmm.
And yeah, I agree. I think time limits can be very frustrating, and finding other ways is really good. Whether that fits necessarily always under that ludonarrative dissonance or not, I think time limits are always a bit of a pain point.
Which is strange because in life, time limits pretty much are part of life, aren't they? I mean, you go to
Mm.
work, you've got to be there for what 8 hours or something, and then you've got to get the work done within that 8 hours. So there's a time limit there, and you've got to get to the train station, when the train leaves, etc., etc. So maybe that's why we don't like them, because we have too many sort of time constraints in our life.
Yeah.
Maybe. So some strategies to avoid ludonarrative dissonance. So integrate gameplay and story. Well, of course. I mean, we want to do that. Design the narrative to justify gameplay mechanics. Yeah, I mean, sure. For instance, side quests should feel like they contribute to the main goal. Yeah, I mean, to me, this is just kind of like, well, yeah, of course. That's game design 101. Integrate gameplay and story. So avoid ludonarrative dissonance. So yeah, that's the first one.
Yeah.
If you
The
don't have
strategy
that
to
one, sorry.
the best strategy is just avoiding it. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Do you want to read the next one?
So framing and context, frame actions in a way that aligns with the story. For example, in Pokemon, battles are framed as training rather than cruelty. Add narrative intermediates to connect unrelated gameplay to the story, e.g., needing resources before progressing.
So yeah, I've certainly seen that happen before. Uh, Particularly when it comes to the killing one. So I guess maybe that's one of the reasons that zombies are so popular in games, because they're not really human anymore, but they look human.
Hmm.
So killing them is kind of okay. Um, yeah, but reframing that. Um, I guess another more subtle one in a lot of games is where enemies wear like a mask or a suit, so they become less human,
Yeah.
which I'm not sure
Yeah.
is is necessarily morally okay, but is challenging. Um,
It's
yeah.
I do find this interesting though because it's especially that the note on connecting unrelated gameplay to the story, needing more resources.
Mm-hmm.
I can see how that justifies the gameplay to the narrative, but I fear we need to be careful because doing that too often can start to feel like you are deliberately putting in arbitrary hurdles in the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which is it's almost like it's still Ludo-narrative dissonance, but it's coming from the opposite side, I guess.
To a degree, I think. Yeah, I think to a degree, you need to be careful about how much you changed your story to fit the narrative, and how well you did it as well. I think we've all seen instances where you can see, oh, yeah, that they've done exactly this. They have added a part to the story to make some of the gameplay make sense, but it doesn't really work very well. But then you kind of go to another game where they do it well, and that's fine. So I guess that's. I think it depends on how well you actually manage to do that. No.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's and I think it depends on the context too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I guess that's part of this point. But thinking about Yakuza, and in Yakuza Zero, there's a there's a character, an NPC, and he teaches you how to upgrade your fighting skills and abilities,
Mm-hmm.
and it's done by purchasing them. And so he just outright calls out, "You're investing in yourself," and that's the most context you get for where the money you've earned is being spent when you're upgrading your own abilities.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess in the context of a game which can be quite tongue-in-cheek and quite comedic in certain areas, you
Mm-hmm.
can get away with just making fun of it and calling it out a little bit. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have to justify in world if your game is set in that sort of comedic frame.
Right, right, right. So that fits in the context.
Yes.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure, for sure. Cool. Dynamic systems introduce dynamic quests that adapt based on timing or players' actions. So this can increase development complexity. Yeah, for sure. I love these. Anyone who has no concept of developing games always comes up with these sort of solutions. Like, oh, just make the story dynamic. It's like, do you have any concept? Any
Just
concept
like
of all?
triple your scope.
Exactly.
How
It's
much
like,
budget did you say you have?
That's right. But just make it all dynamic. Just use AI. Actually, someone said this to me last week. Oh, can't you just can't you just use AI in your games? I'm like, what? Do you realize that they run on server farms? They got there's just yeah. This is the non game developers solution. I think when people don't really get how much time and energy it actually takes to do this sort of things. Huge, huge. So dynamic systems, I'd put a line through that one. That's simply not
I think
feasible.
if you're considering it from the beginning, there are ways to scope around it. Um, but obviously, I always see scope as sort of like a elastic band in a certain sense,
Do
where you can
you? Do
stretch it
you?
and
Do
pull it in
you
some
now?
places, but it will contract and pull on the others, right? So
Okay.
if you're thinking about adding a dynamic system to one part of the gameplay, you have to be aware that it's going to shrink on the other side, and you're going to lose some of that scope for the other things you've decided.
I'd suggest you're also putting in player expectation there. So the player then becomes that the expectation is, oh, there's a dynamic system here. I'm going to expect that through the rest of the game. Fair enough. So that
Yeah.
means you need to introduce those sort of dynamic systems everywhere, which very very quickly becomes, just impossible. So the dynamic systems at this point in time, I'd say no. I think that's very unlikely. Have to be a very simple type of dynamic system. um,
First person narrative design,
which means
focus on embodying the narrative within the gameplay rather than treating it as a separate story being told. This approach emphasizes player agency. focus on embodying the narrative within the gameplay rather than treating it as a separate story being told. I'm not sure I fully understand the strategy here.
That sounds like something I've heard from like a an academic in an academic paper, which kind of uses
It
flamboyant language
feels.
to sort of mean nothing.
I guess if I'm reading it right, it feels like maybe something you could apply as an overarching trend in games. Maybe back in the day, it was much more common for the gameplay to be barely connected to the story. But I
Hmm.
feel nowadays, story is almost always in that first-person narrative. So maybe less of a strategy to avoid it and more of a trend which has developed over time.
So there's an interesting thing that jumps out to me there. Is it? Well, let me ask you a question. How many first-person films or TV shows can you think of where the character is shown in first person?
As in like visual perspective or narrative perspective?
Um, from well, the same way as you play a first-person game. Like,
The one first person movie that was made. Hardcore Henry? Is that what that was called?
sounds familiar. Yeah, yeah. And then there's
So what?
another. The one that it's not a movie actually. It's a what is it? A music video is from The Prodigy. Uh, Smack My Bitch Up is the name of the song. You're familiar with the song? It's a very, very interesting music video. I definitely recommend anyone who hasn't seen it check it out. And that's all in first person. Very, very interesting, and I love what they do with it. Great song, by the way, as well. The title, I'm not sure whether that relates, but the title's a little maybe deliberately um, was designed to be antagonistic, but that's the one that I can think of, and was really, really interesting. And the first person perspective there was really important to the sort of whole story that was being told. But that's the only one that I can think of. So there's very few, and what I was trying to point out there really is that I think there's a good reason that films are not done in first person. And this is why we actually have some trouble in our in our storytelling in first person games, because there's maybe we haven't really sort of identified this, but there is a bit of a challenge in telling a story when you are a main character in the story. I think
Yeah.
that's a big issue.
Yeah, and I think you can see sort of the wake of that. Um, Classic examples like The Last of Us,
Mm-hmm.
you know, awarded as a brilliant story, and I think rightly so.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
But there is that sort of like background murmur where it's like, well, the story itself doesn't really embody interactivity the way the video game does.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the classic example is, the amount of fans who disagreed with actions that were made in both the first and the second one because it isn't something they would do.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I think there's definitely a really interesting sort of dilemma there
Mm.
um, about being the main character or even just a character in a story,
Yeah.
being told you have agency and your choices matter, and then not seeing the consequences of your choices. For sure.
Yes. And I think that will come back a little bit later when I did add something to this myself, and I think we've talked about it before, but very much related to that element that you are a character in the story. I'll go to the next one. Avoid overemphasis on urgency. Avoid creating narratives with extreme urgency if the gameplay allows for open exploration. Well, I mean, isn't that what we kind of came across first up? Yeah.
Yeah, with the time limits.
Yeah, don't do it. So, okay. Well,
I think it's a bit limiting to say avoid creating narratives with extreme urgency.
mm-hmm.
It's like, yeah, I guess that is technically an effective way to avoid Ludo-narrative dissonance, but what do you give up narratively and in the effort of creating a compelling narrative by not implementing extreme urgency. um I think focusing on the gameplay and the game design maybe would benefit you more than altering your narrative so drastically.
Mm. So actually, talking about urgency and time limits, the one instance I can think of that it did work is in the final boss battle of Portal 2. Actually, Portal 1 and Portal 2, come to think of it. But particularly Portal 2. Can you remember?
Yeah, I find that really interesting because uh I I personally almost completely gloss over the fact that those have time limits.
Hmm. Interesting. So why do you think that is?
I feel like perhaps there is quite a tug of war between giving the player enough time that they don't feel cheated if they
Mm-hmm.
run out of time,
Mm-hmm.
but not giving them so much time that they don't feel that pressure.
Mm-hmm.
But especially in Portal 2, I also felt that the if I'm remembering it, there's a lot of effects going on. You have the gas pouring in,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there's like an alarm playing, and there's quite a lot of other effects which we're very used to signifying urgency rather than just a countdown timer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would also say the reason that works is because by the end of that game, your level of skill is very high, and you can kind of deal with it. I think you can deal with it. To me, certainly when I play it now, and having played it multiple times, I guess the time limit's just not an issue. You get so much time. But I think maybe when I first played it was more of an issue. I think maybe I failed it the first time. But it's not right throughout the game. I guess that's the thing. It would be something interesting to play around with, seeing how time limits actually affect players. Whether you could create something which kind of worked throughout a
It
game.
does. Uh, it does make me think of, I can't remember the name of the game, but there was the game where you had like a minute and a half to. The premise, I think, was that there was some cataclysmic event happening,
Mm-hmm.
and you had a minute and a half to try and get the best outcome. And the gameplay loop is, once the minute and a half ran out, you would restart and you would have another go to try again. Sort of like a time loop scenario where each loop you go through it, you learn either the fastest way to do a certain set of actions or learn new potential actions which open up different routes. And so
Um,
that sort of
yeah.
game I think is vital to having that time limit. But it's I guess being in a loop setting, you are reducing the sort of the impact and the failure state that the time limit has, which are sort of eases that pressure that we have when faced on it with a time limit.
Was that an entire game, or was that part of a game?
I believe that was an entire game. I can try looking it up.
Because it reminds me of. Let me see if I can. Hang on, let me just see if I can find it. What's it called again?
There's a game from 2015 called 60 Seconds,
Oh, really?
which is
Okay.
maybe what I'm thinking of. Um, but maybe not exactly. I feel like this has multiple days.
Mm-hmm.
But I swear I remember there a game where it was like one day, and maybe I'm confusing it with another time loop game.
Think of the guy who wrote the Stanley Parable. That's the one I'm thinking of. And of course, I can't find. Wow, I can't see it in my. Oh, the Beginner's Guide. That's what I'm thinking of. Have you found it with the Beginner's Guide?
It's not ringing a bell.
Oh, okay. Definitely want to check out. So there's part of that, yeah, where it's just in one section, where you have that. It's a loop, but it's very quick. So yeah, and you get through. So that worked okay, but again, it was very, very short. So we've got some examples of success here, some positive examples. Can you think of any other positive examples?
Positive examples of mitigating Ludo-narrative dissonance.
Yeah.
I had one when we first started this conversation that I wanted to bring up. I should have wrote it down because I have forgotten. No, nothing's coming to mind. Maybe when we go through some of the examples, it'll come back to me.
So Shadowrun Dragonfall missions tied to raising funds for critical. I mean, I have to admit I haven't played this game, so
yeah, I'm not familiar.
Cyberpunk 2077. In negative examples, story implies urgency due to life-threatening biochip, but players can spend unlimited time on side activities. Yeah, I mean that's the classic. That's kind of the classic thing that the dissonance there. Some narrative choices in Tears of the Kingdom create significant dissonance. Yeah, fair enough. So there's also there was some challenges and opinions. Some arguing ludo-narrative dissonance is inevitable in games due to the interactive nature. Well, I would say that's a design choice. You can choose to leave it in there, or you can choose to design your game in a way to avoid them. Do you agree there, or?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say it's inevitable. Definitely not. I mean, maybe in a certain context, maybe if you're talking about AAA games specifically, given the trends, maybe you could argue it is inevitable, but definitely not in indie games. I think there's plenty. You could find dozens and dozens of examples where there's no perceivable dissonance.
So others believe players prioritize fun over strict narrative consistency, making the issue less critical for most games. I mean, yes, to a degree, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that is sort of a really good way to summarize what I was saying about Yakuza 0, right? If the game is already in that context of being lighthearted in certain aspects, then you're more easily able to forgive. And yeah, it's tough because I guess that ludo-narrative dissonance still exists, but we're just not feeling the dissonance from it.
Or we choose to ignore it sometimes even.
Yeah,
for sure. A few suggest abandoning traditional storytelling in favor of gameplay-driven narratives. Does that make any sense to you? Throw you in the deep end.
I guess maybe looking at big examples, I'd say the difference between Last of Us and say Baldur's Gate 3 is maybe what that's getting at. And again, I feel like that's that conversation of scope, right? It's a lot easier to have a strict narrative that isn't impacted versus, something like Baldur's Gate or the classic, like Walking Dead. What was the name of that studio that made Walking Dead game and all those other choice?
Oh,
Telltale.
Telltale, yeah.
Yeah, I guess maybe that's what they mean by gameplay-driven narratives. But yeah, again, that's a lot of dynamic systems that take a lot of effort, a lot of scope.
Also, very, very like the Telltale games are very almost like kind of like interactive comics in almost in a way. Like they were very. You only had certain choices you could make within those, from what I recall.
Yeah. Yeah, I think early on it was very much. The gameplay was basically QuickTime events.
Yeah.
I think they tried to remedy that a bit towards the end, but yeah, I mean, Telltale has a long, interesting history, which you
towards
can
the
dive
end.
into.
That's an interesting way to put it. Towards the end, doesn't that sort of suggest something there as well? They didn't succeed. So there was one thing I wanted to bring up, which I find strange that this doesn't come up, because to me this is far more interesting than this ludo-narrative dissonance. And that's what I've just added this myself here, the ludo-narrative integration or reinforcement. And it comes back to, well, the situation where the gameplay actually ties in closely with the narrative and reinforces the player's role in the story. So this is going in the other direction. Done well, it can have a strong effect on the player. And the example that I always put up here is, and it's a very simple example. This is the reason I find it really interesting, and it's also first person. So this one where we went through Silent Hills PT a few weeks ago, where the player has to interact with that photo. Do you recall that? Do you recall that
Yes.
part? Yeah, with the murdered wife. To continue, the interaction causes a cigarette burned hole to appear in the place of the eye in a photo, with a lovely sound effect as well. And interestingly enough, and that really does. If you're playing the game, and it's not the same if you're watching it, but if you're playing that game, it makes you feel complicit in the actions of the murderer in the story. And to me, that's one of the most powerful examples of tying. It's not even game. Well, it is gameplay because you need to do that action to continue on. But it's so simple. Basically, just press X on the controller, and all of a sudden, you feel really complicit in this game. So I think the more you can get that, you're kind of screwing with your player's head as well in a way. Coming back to what we were talking about before about you are both an observer and a participant in a story, and maybe that's the key, is that we don't consider that reality enough. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I fully agree. I think leaning into it is one of the most exciting things we can do with narrative in games, and it's like you can have it on a really broad scale as well, right? Like I think of The Last of Us Part 2, spoilers, I guess, when you play as Abby, and I think the popular sort of emotion there was frustration and anger towards the game itself for having to play as what had been considered the enemy or the main antagonist for the first however many hours. And so you have that really broad sort of like meta narrative conflict, but even down to click holding, which I think I mentioned on stream the other week. The premise of click holding is essentially you need money for X reason, and so you've met up with this guy who promises to give it to you if you can click a counter to 10,000. And so through the course of clicking, he makes more and more strange and concerning demands of you. And so it's really tight, where it's like the mechanic in the game you have to actively participate in to progress it. And so all the while the game's narrative is sort of making you feel uncomfortable and causing that conflict there.
Oh, interesting. So that really is tied in with so I guess maybe is that the key, is that it's easier to do that when the gameplay is really quite simple?
Yeah, I think from a game design point of view, yes. I think if the gameplay is simple, it's far easier. I guess it's really fun because inherently Ludo-narrative has those two sides. So I guess, and on the contrast, the narrative side is probably a lot easier when you're working with an expansive game like Last of Us.
Yeah, so I'm just aware of the time. We should probably move on. I do have a story that I could tell, but I'm sure it would take a long time to go into. But about the power of games. So we might go into that, and we might talk about that actually another time because I think there's a lot of power in games, and there is research in social psychology using game engines and putting people in different avatars, which can have quite a powerful effect. But again, that's kind of psychology type stuff. So we might go into that another time. It's a very interesting sort of thing to go into. But anyway.